Alright, now I want to talk about Chapter 52, the one that's an introduction to ecology. And so we can study ecology at various levels. You can study how individual organisms respond and interact with their surroundings, and then you can look at populations being all the individuals of a particular species. How do they get along in their environment and do what they need to do? We can move up to the community level, which is looking at a group of interacting species in a particular area. And so at that level, you're focusing on the living things. When we move up to the ecosystem level, we're studying how living things interact with their non-living surroundings, and how the surroundings affect living things. And so at the community level, as I'll mention later, we are focusing on the biotic community, the living things. At the ecosystem level, we're bringing into account the abiotic factors, the non-living things. Landscape ecology looks at large areas of land and is basically ecosystem on a large scale. And you're concerned with major, you'll bring in geological factors and how they influence the landscape and living things, for example. And then, of course, you've got the whole globe, the biosphere, if you will, the realm of space that where we find living things. And so perhaps if you study something like climate change, you might be working at the global scale. All right, some of the main things that impact living things. Of course, sunlight is extremely important. That it energizes natural systems. And so you'll notice that essentially all of Earth's surface gets sunlight, but it doesn't get the same intensity of sunlight. It's perhaps not surprising that at the equator you're getting more direct sunlight. Essentially, a given unit of light is falling on a smaller surface of the Earth's surface, and that's why the equator tends to be warm and tropical, because all that sunlight and intense sunlight they're getting. Whereas, because of the curvature of the Earth, the sun that hits further north and south is more spread out, and so there is less energy per unit area as you go away, and those areas are cooler because of that. The sun drives the movement of air around the globe. What happens, and you've probably seen this on weather maps, they put the H's and the L's, and the H's and L stands for high and low pressure system. Where you get intense heating of the Earth by the sun, it warms the air, and that air rises. And that is a low pressure zone. There's less pressure because the air is rising. When that happens, the air tends to cool as it goes up, form clouds, and you tend to get precipitation at these low pressure areas. Of course, the air only goes to the upper reaches of the atmosphere, and then it circles to the north and south, and it descends at a high pressure area. These tend to be relatively dry areas and periods of weather when you have high pressure systems, because you have air that's descending and becoming warmer, and as that happens, it holds on to the moisture that it has. Okay. Now, these create these sort of circulating patterns of air that generally run between 0 and 30 degrees, 30 degrees and 60 degrees, and 60 degrees and 90 degrees. These things are known as Hadley cells, by the way. And so you get low pressures at the equator, higher pressure, generally at around 30, lower pressure further north, and then high pressure at the poles. Now, of course, these things shift as wind moves them around somewhat, but that's the general pattern. Notice that the air coming from the north and coming from the south is moving along the surface of the Earth towards the equator. And when you look at the way it's actually moving, it's not moving in a straight line from north to south and south to north, but it's moving at an angle. That is, the wind is deflected, and this occurs due to what's called the Coriolis effect, which is caused by the fact that you have this air moving along the surface, but the surface is rotating underneath the air because of the rotation of the Earth, and it causes sort of a deflection of the air. And so, I don't know if you talk about this in history class, but you've got this converging air at the equator that moves from the east to the west, and these are known as the trade winds because those are the winds that sailors would use to cross the Atlantic back in the day. Alright, so the input of sun, light, the movement of air and water around the globe creates the different biomes. You can divide Earth's biomes into three main types. There are what you call the tropics, areas around the equator that are warm year-round. You have temperate areas, which have seasons, cool seasons and warm seasons. And then towards the poles, you basically have an Arctic climate where it is cold most or all of the year. So you have tropical, temperate, and Arctic. Now within those zones, you can have wet areas, such as tropical rainforests, or the eastern deciduous forest, where we live, where it's fairly damp. You can also have dry areas, so you can have tropical deserts, basically the Sahara or the Namib Desert or tropical deserts. You can have more temperate deserts, like up in the Tibetan Plateau. The southwest United States is sort of in between. It's not really tropical. It's more of a warm, temperate area, but it's dry. They do get cool, cold nights, and the wintertime can be a little cool, but not as cold as here. And then as you go further north, you get shorter growing seasons. You get these, what are called these coniferous forests, or these boreal forests that cover much of Canada and Siberia. Vast tracts of evergreen trees with long winters and shorter growing seasons. And then once you get further north of that, you get into tundra, which is a biome where you don't find trees because it's characterized by having permafrost. That is ground that is permanently frozen. The surface will thaw out in the summertime, but you just go a few feet down and it's permanently frozen, and so trees really don't grow in these areas. Let's go through. Okay, we'll go back to that in a second. So the seasons, as is probably self-evident to you, is caused by the tilt of the Earth and the rotation of the Earth around the Sun, such that we are now somewhere right around here. We're in springtime. We're approaching the summer solstice, the June solstice, whereas about June 20th or 21st, the Earth's tilt relative to the Sun will be its maximum tilt, with the northern hemisphere toward the Sun. And of course, we have our warm summers then. You have the fall, the spring and fall equinox, where the Earth's axis is perpendicular to the Sun, and you have exactly 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. And then you have the December or winter solstice, where the northern hemisphere is tilted away, and our days at that time are much shorter than they are other times of the year. So this influences the length of days and the intensity of the sunlight you're getting throughout the year. Now, something that's not mentioned in the book, I don't believe, but is important for long-term patterns of climate, and I just want to make a distinction between climate and weather. Weather are the current atmospheric conditions. What's happening in the atmosphere, whether it's cloudy or sunny, whether it's dry or it's rainy, cool or warm. Climate is the long-term pattern of the weather throughout the year and from year to year. So tropical climates are warm year-round. Temperate climates have a warm season and a cool season. Now, these climates can change over time, as you know from the movie Ice Age, where it was a much cooler period of Earth's history. About 18,000 years ago is when we were at the peak of the last Ice Age. These long-term patterns and the change of the climate are due to a large extent by what are called the Milankovitch cycles. And they involve the Earth's rotation around the Sun and the angle of the Earth towards the Sun. So the Earth's orbit, and this is very much an exaggerated image, but it's just for demonstration purposes. The Earth's orbit shifts from being more circular to less circular, or more eccentric, or egg-shaped, you might say. And so you can have periods in Earth history when there's not a whole lot of differences in terms of how far the Earth is from the Sun, and other times when the Earth's orbit takes it further from the Sun. Okay, and so it would be getting less intense sunlight if it's further, obviously. And also the angle of the Earth can shift. We're at about, I believe, 23.5 right now. But it ranges, it has a range, becoming more or less angled towards the Sun. So you can imagine a situation where if these two cycles coincide, and these cycles are on different time scales. Eccentricity, I believe, is about 100,000 years. I think this obliquity, or the Earth's angle, is, I want to say, at about 40,000 years. So if they happen to coincide such that the Earth is further away from the Sun, when it's also at the northern hemisphere is at its maximum tilt away from the Sun, you're going to get particularly cold winters, and that's when ice is going to be able to build up, and you can possibly have an ice age. Now the precession one is a little interesting in that it doesn't really affect periods of time long term when it's colder or warmer, but when the different seasons happen. Think of the Earth as a top that wobbles on its axis. You know, when you spin a top, at first it's standing straight up, but then it starts to wobble on the axis. Well, that's what the Earth's axis does. It wobbles. So what that means is the seasons slowly get later throughout the year. We now have our summer solstice at around June 21st, but that point in time is getting slightly later in the season, and this cycle happens on about a 23,000 year time period. So to make long story short, in about 11,500 years from now, the summer solstice will be happening on December 21st. That is, the northern hemisphere will be tilted towards the Sun in December and tilted away from the Sun in June. Again, this happens in a slow time scale, but essentially the seasons shift throughout the year because of the Earth wobbling on its axis. All right, the Earth's oceans play a big role on weather and climate by basically moving lots of heat around the globe. You see you've got these general circulatory patterns, clockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere, and as water comes across the equator, it warms up and it hits the land and heads north and takes heat with it, so that, if you notice, there's a slight difference on the eastern side of continents. Up here in the northern hemisphere, you have warm water coming from the south, whereas on the western side you have cooler water coming from the north. All right, now you notice because of the Canada here, it sort of causes the water to sort of head across the Atlantic, and it doesn't get quite as far north as out in the Pacific, and it takes a lot of heat with it over to Europe. And this makes Europe, particularly Western Europe's climate, much warmer than it would be otherwise because of that warm water coming across the ocean. So Great Britain and Ireland have temperate climates. It gets cold in the winter, but it doesn't get nearly as cold as central Canada, which you can see it's at about the same latitude. It's because central Canada has a continental climate that's not influenced by large bodies of water, and it gets quite cold in the wintertime. Whereas all this water that surrounds much of Europe, and again, this warm water that comes across the Atlantic, moderates the climate. And of course, Spain can be quite warm. We think of the Mediterranean area as having a nice warm climate, but essentially it's at the same latitude as us, but we have much colder winters, again, because we're in the middle of a continent. So these coastal areas, because of all this water that's close to them, they tend to have more moderate climates. They don't have the extremes of hot and cold that you get in the middle of continents, because that water has the ability to absorb a lot of heat and